I don't think you quite realise how boring video games would be if they felt the same today as they did many decades ago. And I'm not really talking about technological advancements, because that was always likely to happen, but could you imagine a world where games just kind of stood still and never tried to do anything new? It sounds really depressing, doesn't it? It sounds like the post-apocalyptic future we might be hurtling towards if everyone decides to copy Fortnite and refuse to do anything original because everyone loves Fortnite. How can we go wrong? Change and variety are very important elements in game design that affect a game's staying power over time, which is why genuine innovation is valued as high as it is. I'm not talking about fiddling around with motion controls or shoehorning VR into every genre under the sun. I'm talking about the work that is done on a basic mechanical level to separate one game from the next. If we didn't have these distinctive differences, I don't think I would have gotten this far with video games. But every dog has its day, and so the sun must set on certain game mechanics that outstay their welcome. This is something that has to happen, since a lot of games have features that only exist because of technical limitations or because of trends that were trendy many moons ago, and the world has moved on in significant ways in that time. I can't help but feel like there's a degree of arrogance in continuing on with the old ways and plowing on despite so many signs warning you to maybe stop and reconsider. We need innovation, otherwise we'll all start regressing until we're back into the ocean as single-celled organisms, feasting on gnarly space ingredients. I don't know about you, but I'm quite fond of my arms and legs the way they are now. I won't lie, I'm a tad concerned about uprooting too many trees here. If I sit here and say that a genre has been doing something for too long, I think everyone is justified in saying, "No, RabbidLuigi, you can't do something like that. You're being crazy and very inconsiderate right now." And yeah, I get that and understand your concerns, but also, fuck it, I'ma do it anyway. So I play a lot of RPGs these days, since they're a genre that is very easy to understand from a gameplay standpoint, and once you're in and invested in what's going on, you're not getting out for dozens of hours. But there's one through line that has been plaguing RPGs for generations. And it's not the fact that most of them stop making sense about 2/3 of the way in. That just comes with the territory. Think back to the last RPG you played, and that's a genuine Japanese-style RPG and not any kind of action RPG or strategy RPG, where they have a few unique features in place to keep you on your toes. There's every chance that the last RPG you played had some form of random encounters in there, since it's one of the most common defining components of the genre, and it's something that every RPG was doing for the longest time. And that might be why I'm playing more RPGs than I ever have nowadays, since these kind of games a few years ago were insufferably full of random encounters. You walk around in a cave or in some tall grass and a randomized enemy leaps out looking for someone to fight, and then some experience points spill out onto the ground once they're defeated. This is a cycle that has been run through a hilariously large number of times at this point, and I for one am really sick of the sight of it. I think the idea is to make basic navigation of a game world a challenge as bad guys throw themselves at you at every corner, but also don't. If I want to go fight an enemy, I'll go fight an enemy. If I feel like I want to make my character stronger, I'll be the one to take the initiative and pursue the enemy myself. Pokemon was a victim of this problem for the longest time, and it looked like there was no end in sight as it continued through Pokemon Sun and Moon and their expansion packs, but there was unexpected hope. The Let's Go games, for all their faults, fucking nailed what I've wanted Pokemon to do for years by showing the models in the overworld. Now, if I want to go find something, I can make that decision myself and walk over to it. Thankfully, most modern RPGs seem to be switching over to something very similar to this, so I'm holding out hope that this is one mechanic that is being phased out across the board. My life is crazy enough as it is, please don't make more things random for me. Whenever there's a current trend that a developer can shadow and are virtually guaranteed to profit from, I think it's very understandable when the little quirks of that trend are lent on pretty heavily. That's a mouthful that uses more words than were really needed to make my point, and hey, you must be new here if you think that's not going to happen again, but I believe we should expect similar games to use very similar mechanics. It can be a little disappointing when developers become reluctant to branch out and try anything too crazy or new, but all I know is that every third-person shooter from the last decade used cover shooting, and I'd really rather they didn't, and I wish it would go away forever. I'm not sure how realistic that last bit is, but I have the sort of blind faith usually reserved for fans of Bethesda games. We know nothing will change, but maybe if we pray hard enough? Short of animal or human sacrifices, cover shooting isn't going anywhere since its use over the last couple of decades has been so widespread that I genuinely can't think of an alternative. So what I'm saying is that this thing is terrible and I hate it, but I'm not willing to offer any kind of constructive, useful criticism. I'm the average YouTube comment. If there's one thing I can do on this channel and the wildly self-inflated ego that it gives me, it'll be to call lazy developers out on their stupid lazy bullshit. It's great fun, makes me feel all warm and fuzzy inside. Third-person shooters have relied on cover shooting for as long as I remember, and when we were just starting out, I'll admit that it was a fun novelty. You hug some fence or structure and peek out your little cheeky face so you can widow some wives, and it works with such a simple flow that you soon start to realize that every encounter is the same. You can change up the setting and environment, but as long as you have some cover to hide behind, it'll all start to feel nigh on identical. Any variety you get usually comes from that one level where there isn't a lot of cover to rely on, so instead you need to think about what you're doing and where you are. It's way more fun to shoot down a room full of bad guys when you can't just glue yourself to the nearest bit of cover, which is why first-person shooters are often significantly more exciting in this regard, since very few of them ever make it that easy for you, and much prefer to let you fend for yourself. There's a lot of blood and violence happening right now. If I'm supposed to be at least 15 years old in order to play this game, I'm probably smart enough to work out a way of not dying without so much help. You gotta let them fly eventually. A wise man once said that you just gotta go fast in order to get anything done in life, and that is a very important mantra that I've tried to implement in my life wherever possible. But also, it's got me thinking about how some games handle movement better than others, and how it's this incredibly important component, because if a game has difficulty with movement, if movement in a game isn't fun, you're in for a hard time. This is something that I started to notice more and more as FPS games started doing fancy things with movement. You had games like Titanfall and Call of Duty Advanced Warfare reinventing how you get burly military dudes across the battlefield, and I think this kind of freedom of movement helps these games to stand out. Not that I want to compare Overwatch and Team Fortress 2 if I don't have to, even if one of these games still has a functioning economy, but both of these games have classes or characters that do a bit more than just plod around from A to B. Make movement interesting and you're onto a winner. Make movement dull as dishwater and too reliant on a sprint button and I'll sleep so hard it'll look like a fucking mattress advert. This isn't always the case, but the vast majority of games don't need a sprint mechanic. I get the idea of action-adventure games that try to use stealth in some capacity needing to have variable movement speeds, but my logic has always been that if a game feels like it needs a sprint button, the standard walk speed probably needs to be faster. Or maybe you can compress your overworld a bit so it's more densely populated with interesting shit and I don't feel inclined to sprint past most of it. Or you can implement vehicles or animals that give the player a faster method of transport. My point is that sprinting is often used as a crutch to lean on in lieu of bad design decisions that developers can't be bothered to fix. That being said, the exceptions to this rule can be very fun to use if there's more to them than just a button or thumbstick that you keep compressed for minutes at a time. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild worked in jumping, climbing, and even gliding alongside a stamina gauge that limits your running to just a handful of seconds. And your movement options are so varied in this game that simply running feels boring. Which is the whole point. Running is boring, so you better surf some shields or ride that sick motorbike you got from that monk. When sprinting is the only thing you can do and it's mapped to its own button, I genuinely die a little inside. Sprinting? More like, sprinting to go buy a better game. These developers have never tried running, have they? It's actually really tedious. Just give me a bike or a rowing boat instead, please. Here's an interesting question for everyone at home to chew over. Do you think the ability of the average gamer has gotten better or worse since the 80s? History would suggest that we've probably regressed a bit, since games these days come with a few more creature comforts than before, since you don't have to empty your pockets into an arcade machine all afternoon just to make a tiny amount of progress. But then again, I think the upper end of that spectrum is constantly pushing boundaries and seeing just how good they can be at a game, be it speedrunning or something like esports. The true answer is likely that there hasn't been much change, but honestly I think that conclusion makes it even more irritating that so many games still won't let you skip over tutorials. I got places to be, damn it! I can count on one hand the number of tutorials that I've sat through and genuinely enjoyed. Maybe I'll make that video one day, but for now, these days we have this ridiculous push to make every game as accessible to every human being of every ability, and it means that they push these tutorials right to the front of the game and make sure that no one can possibly get lost. And we're now in 2019, and I really would rather they didn't. I'd be lying if I said tutorials weren't useful or a necessary part of 99% of games out there, but I think I can acknowledge their importance while still not being a fan of how clunky they've become over the years. Maybe this says more about the pacing of some games that take a long time to get going, where they don't have a cast iron tutorial that you can skip over, and instead the game chooses to teach you by holding your hand for the best part of an hour until it's confident that you can fend for yourself in this wildly complicated game world that's been made. And I appreciate the concern, it's very welcome, I love it a lot, but come on! I'm a grown-ass man, I can take care of myself. I made it all the way to Canada and back last week without someone showing me where I need to go every 2 seconds, which is great because I had poutine and met so many people, and there was this one blackboard in the poutineery that said something about subscribing to RabbidLuigi's YouTube channel and hitting the bell for notifications of new uploads, so pretty good trip overall. But yeah, tutorials, we don't need them, or at least we need more examples like The Witcher 3, where you're given the opportunity to avoid it entirely and get on with the more exciting parts of the game. On repeat playthroughs, tutorials are a gigantic early obstacle for a game to overcome, and it really doesn't have to be that way. Hey, you guys worked out how to let a boy skip cutscenes that he's watched before. Would it be so hard to do the same with tutorials? Just think how enriched life would be. It's recently been brought to my attention that Super Mario Maker is a pretty dope way of understanding game design. I mean, I had a hunch a few years ago, but playing through some of the finest and least finest levels that this community has to offer in the sequel paints a fascinating picture of the many ways in which a game can be designed both good and horrendously bad. But regardless of each level's quality, there remains a consistency that holds true in the face of rampant creativity. You can have a player escape hordes of ravenous enemies and do nothing as the level plays itself, but one fact remains the same. Extra lives mean nothing anymore. Well, unless you're playing endless mode, but that just makes it a small part of this game. Everywhere else, you get this wonderful allegory for game design, including the phasing out of the very traditional and very arbitrary system of lives continues and triggering game overs from running out of both. It was a staple of most games from the 80s and 90s where you need to keep an eye on how many lives you had left so you weren't caught out by a sudden upturn in difficulty, falling a long way between checkpoints. It spanned across every genre from shoot 'em ups and platformers to beat 'em ups and first-person shooters. And for a long time, life management was just a thing you did in most games. Gaining an extra life and staving off the ominous aura of a game over was a huge part of a lot of games, even after arcade games died down in popularity and it was no longer a reflection of sticking more coins in the machine to continue playing. So, what happened? Games got more complicated, that's what happened. Whereas before games had limited lives to increase the playtime and value for money for short adventures, longer games don't have to rely so much on this idea and switch to a less punishing system of checkpoints and manual saving depending on the game. The big upside to using this is that death isn't as punishing as it used to be and more of a gentle nudge back a few minutes, which is really helpful if death happens often. If you think of how trickier games like Dark Souls and Faster Than Life handle the difficulty, or even high precision platformers like Super Meat Boy and Celeste where you'll die thousands of times, limiting the number of times a player can retry before they lose their progress was never likely to be something that withstood the test of time. There's still a few games out there that are attempting to preserve with limited lives, but the clock is ticking, and time waits for no man, woman or video game. This is RabbidLuigi, and the unique thing about the life system is that it's a mechanic that has undergone a successful transformation into something more interesting and significantly less archaic. And that's really encouraging, because that means any stupid trend could potentially undergo a similar kind of metamorphosis into something more useful. I don't really know how you change microtransactions to be something good and helpful and useful, but people are paid way more than me to work that shit out. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.